Hello, I'm David Bradley, aka Schizophreniforms, and this is a cross-correlatory piece of writing on a similar subject to the two-part video I released for the White Book series. And I just basically picked the most relevant piece of writing from the Black Book that cross-correlated with the Procession of Awarenesses. So there's two videos on the White Book called Procession of Awarenesses Part A, Part B. And this is kind of non-transrational perspective on that the idea of there being a monopoly on consciousness or the perception of people, dependent on the sort of common logic behind what it is possible to perceive and how these things are. So that's kind of vague, but stick with it and hopefully you'll see something you'd like in this information, and if not, feel free to comment and say otherwise. I'll be right back. So yeah, we're talking about subjectivity basically, just to get started with this, and that the fundamental experience of every human being is subjective. This is taken from chapter 4, I believe, of article 1 of the Black Book, which is quite an extensive document at this stage. So, and I'm just sort of recording this now because it's deeply relevant to the other videos I've released on the channel. I think I said that in the earlier part of the video, which are about the Procession of Awareness A and Procession of Awareness B. So I'm just going to go into the text and I'll stop and start where necessary. The fundamental experience of every human being is subjective. One cannot know for certain that, for example, when I see red, that you are not seeing yellow. But because when you see red and I see yellow, we're referring to the same external stimuli. So my red could be your yellow, or even wildly different from person to person what the actual colour looks like to the subjective experiencer. Further, it is not possible to know what a feeling actually feels like to another person, because someone's experience of, say, love may wildly vary from that person to person due to their subjective experience of what love is like. One person whom has experienced very little affection may experience love as kind words or gestures, another may experience it as sexual intimacy and love, and so on and so forth. The point is that we have limited subjective frame of reference with which to determine whether there is an objectively measurable universe surrounding us. And as mentioned in the last chapter, which you won't have read unless you've read the book, we have evolved specialist senses and instincts, and that the objective world is only that which can be perceived collectively and is by our evolution woefully inaccurate and easily fooled. And it's saying here to cite free will experiments with Sam Harris and discuss. I might leave that for now, but it's quite well established, as far as I'm aware, scientifically and through neuroscience experiments, that. And actually, there was this other article that I read, and then I watched a video about it that sort of followed up on it, to do with this cognitive modelling and these cognitive scientists that tried to make a computer model where, based on perception of the environment and then special survival skills, and this is be in the book, but it basically suggests strongly that having accurate perception is not only not beneficial to your well-being or existence or proliferation of the species, but it actually has a negative impact on your survival. So accurate perception and free will itself kind of limit the ability to survive and are deselected for by natural selection. That's the rough gist of that. The point is that, sorry, I'll continue reading. The point is that it cannot be asserted that there are universals in perception, nor can it be determined that one's subjective experience of reality is correct, nor can it be determined that any one particular perception is false, and that in fact a lot of fundamental assumptions about our own perceptions are inaccurate anyway. It would seem that there is a bit of a monopoly on what is real based on the agreed perceptual potentials of humanity, and that the monopoly is dictated by the assertions of people in an ordinary waking state of consciousness that is by definition one of only a huge spectrum of potential ranges of awareness and perception. More on this later, so this will be in Article 3, I discussed this later on in the book. We know that it may not even be possible to perceive something unless it has a label or pre-existing structure in the mind to display that it is possible. For example, there were tribes, and I'm said to cite the study, but we can do that later on, who could not see the colour blue, but had the ability to detect 30 or so distinct shades of green, simply because they had no word for blue, but that 30 or so distinct words for green. It was roughly around those figures. It was something like that, around 30 to 50 different words for the colour green. This demonstrates that without belief or structure with which to make the associated label of something, it may literally never be perceived. Now, this will lead us on to the idea that when presented with kind of psychotic experiences, the person in that perception will not have adequate experience or linguistic tools to accurately describe what they are sensing, which further confounds the process of being rejected and labelled insane or dangerous, simply because they cannot relay in any rational way what they're sensing. Insomuch as to say, if you cannot recognise what you are seeing, or articulate it in a relatable way, you are seen as insane. Now, this happens for two reasons, with varying degrees of justification whether that should be the case. Number one, the experience is so overwhelming and misunderstood that fear consumes the person, which A, prevents logical or detailed navigation, or indeed the ability to form a narrative surrounding the experience, and B, prevents recognition of what information is within the experience, and thus any attempt to convey it requires metaphor, vagueness, incoherence, and disordered thought, and C, requires the description of what something is like to try and convey the experience, and even in normal expressions of abstract concepts, any attempt to describe something with language in normal terms necessarily falls short of the real experience, and thus we see great disparity and frustration when trying to articulate what they sense. 2. The attempt to make sense or indeed comprehend on the part of either person in a dialogue requires collective agreement on what is objectively measurable. If one side cannot, does not, or will not share the perceptions of the other, they can never relate to it. Therefore, any attempt to describe something about the psychotic experience elicits two processes. A. The person attempting to understand translates what the person is saying through their own perception of reality and creates a false narrative, which surrounds that experience, and then the surrounding the experience being described, which, as discussed, has already been pitifully described anyway, due to the lack of experience of that state, and indeed religious metaphor is often used by psychotic patients as a way of conveying their perceptions, as it is remarkably close to the experience they have, yet inherently falls short of accuracy. And B, the person conveying the information feels false assurance that they are understood, or indeed grave frustration that they are not, which creates mistrust when that illusion is shattered by the recipient's inaccurate rebuttal of the statement, and an intense fear and isolation because they feel that they are not only the only one who can experience it, but therefore they must be insane. If it's not a cross-correlated experience with other people, then the only justification is that they've lost their mind. That's the only way to interpret it. This confusion and lack of descriptive ability or experience with the state of psychosis essentially causes people to shut down the experience as violently as possible and as soon as possible, both in the person who's in that state and anyone who's attempting to discuss it with. This is a form of kind of perceptual prejudice, where the blind lead the sighted and the sighted think they're mad. Simply because the experience cannot be described or understood, the assertion is that it must not be real, regardless of the potential value of that state and perception, or state and those perceptions. So that is quite a heavy-going thing. So this is relevant to the other writing on the White Book sort of playlist, and it's of deep personal interest to me, because I spent years using terminology that was threatening, dangerous, necessarily to the perceptions of other people I was trying to describe my experiences to. Because on the one hand, the religious metaphor that I used to describe, or the allegorical interpretation, or even the literalist interpretation of what I was explaining to people, seemed insane because most people don't perceive that. Now, I said before in the writing that I was reading, there's like a monopoly on what is accepted. So like religious people can say certain things within certain bounds, but if they start to literally interpret things as though they're phenomenologically distinct and real, even the religion themselves tends to repress and suggest otherwise, and that they might be insane. Yeah, so I'm kind of running low on time, but the basic gist is that if you find it incredibly difficult to describe something that's incredibly difficult to perceive with any accuracy, that it's quite rational for both the individual experiencing it to think they've gone insane and other people to think they've gone insane. But that does not mean that the experiences are invalid, not useful, not potentially real. And it also does not mean that you can simply dismiss offhand the content of that information, and that the important thing for recovery, the important thing for learning to navigate a severe mental health issue that involves hallucinations and other dimensions and other levels of reality and interpretations, is to create a clearing of the trauma, is to create a space with which there's a distance from the experience itself, and that distance will facilitate the ability to decipher it better. And that a big part of my personal recovery has been learning to translate basically potentially insane levels of experience into rational experiences, to decipher it and to make sense of the content in a way that doesn't scare the shit out of people or myself, you know. So that's been a black book discussion that seems oddly relevant to the procession of awareness. So I think that's all I can think of to say at the moment. So unless I add a little addendum, please, if you find this interesting, like the video, subscribe, potentially share it with people that might find this useful. And there's a little bell notification next to the subscribe button as well, that if you want to click, if you want to see more of these videos. There's two aspects to the channel. There's the white book and the black book. And depending on what stage you're at in your own progress or interest, or how you might be relating to this content, say you have a family member or friend who's psychotic or has schizophrenia or something like that, or a psychotic disorder, or you are in fact psychotic and looking for these different perspectives and how to integrate them, feel free to leave comments, feel free to leave subjects of discussion that I can actually go over, because it all helps contribute to both the books and my own personal development. So I'm enormously indebted to you if you leave comments of any interest, and it helps prompt me of what might be interesting to put in the book about my own experience. So thank you for watching. I've been David Bradley, aka Schizophreniforms. Thank you. Goodbye.